December in Montana has a way of making the wilderness feel alive in a way most people never notice. The snow is thick, soft, and unbroken across the valleys, muffling every sound except for what you create yourself. We had inherited the cabin from our grandfather, a small, weathered structure perched on a ridge above a frozen creek. It was remote even by Montana standards, a long drive down dirt roads, then a mile hike through forest to reach the front door. That first winter alone up there felt heavier than I expected, colder and lonelier, but it had a strange appeal. My brother and I both thought it would be simple, quiet, a chance to escape the noise of the world. The first night we stayed there, the cold came in deep and sharp. The wood creaked as it settled under the frost, and the wind swept through the pines with a low, almost groaning whistle. We went to bed early. In the middle of the night, I woke to a sound. It was subtle at first, a scraping on snow, a rhythm that wasn't quite right for animals. My brother was still asleep, and I tried to convince myself it was elk or a moose passing near the cabin. It went on for hours, step after step, dragging. The snow didn't compress like an animal's hooves. Whatever it was deliberate, consistent, and slow, circling the cabin without stopping, never speeding up. Morning came, and the sunlight turned the snow into bright, jagged reflections. I pointed out the tracks, but my brother just shrugged. He said elk, nothing more. It seemed reasonable. The wilderness was full of large animals. It was cold enough for anything to move through snow without leaving much else behind. But the dragging sound had been unlike anything I'd ever heard, and I couldn't shake the tension that tightened in my chest all day. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard it again, just a whisper through the trees. The second night, the scraping returned. It followed the same rhythm, circle after circle. I tried to watch from the window, but the darkness swallowed the forest beyond the porch. The snow was a perfect, blank white canvas. No footprints, nothing to track, just the sound. It didn't matter how long I listened. It didn't change pace, it didn't stop. My brother slept like a stone, untroubled. I stayed awake, crouched against the cold glass, straining to hear. Each rotation around the cabin sounded like a weight being drugged, not lightly, but heavy. The sound was impossible to place. Branches snapping in frost? Maybe. The drag scraping rhythm against the snow? That was the part that didn't belong. By the third night, we were both tense, quiet, the kind of quiet where the smallest noise feels amplified. The wind had died, leaving the night unnervingly still. I heard the scraping again, the dragging around the cabin. It didn't come in fits, didn't speed up, didn't pause. There was a patience in it, like whoever, or whatever, was moving had no hurry. At one point, I got a flashlight and stepped outside, careful not to make a sound. The snow was untouched, no footprints, nothing but the icy stillness. But when I pressed my hand against the window frame on the side of the cabin, I saw them. Faint smudges in the frost, not the broad prints of an animal. Handprints. Too long, fingers too thin, joints bending at angles that seemed wrong, stretching across the glass like something had tried to see inside. They were outside, pressed against the cold, leaving patterns in the frost that didn't belong to anyone we knew, or anything alive we could identify. I backed away slowly. My brother was asleep, snoring softly. I didn't wake him. I couldn't. There was no one else for miles. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of light, maybe frost patterns that looked like hands. But I had been close enough, my fingers brushing the frost where those prints had been, feeling the tiny ridges and dips, the subtle smudges that suggested weight, the pressure of a palm. It was a deliberate mark. Someone or something had been there. The forest was empty, the air sharp and clear, and the snow untouched except for the circle that had been traced around the cabin all night. Morning light brought more details. There were deeper grooves in the snow, almost like the scraping had compressed the crust in a way normal animals wouldn't. Branches nearby were bent as though something had pushed through them carefully, deliberately, without snapping them. The silence of the mountains was overwhelming, but beneath it there was this subtle tension, like the land itself had witnessed something it refused to acknowledge. My brother still said nothing beyond calling it elk, and I let it drop, though a knot of unease tightened in my chest. We stayed busy that day, chopping wood, stacking supplies, trying to normalize everything. But the dragging sound lingered in my mind. The fourth night, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined it circling, hearing that slow, steady scrape over and over. I sat in the corner of the cabin, flashlight across my lap, ears straining. Outside, I thought I saw movement in the shadows beyond the trees. Something shifting, careful, slow, deliberate. I would blink, and it would be gone. The snow held no prints, but the air carried a faint creak, like a heavy weight being shifted across ice. At one point, I went to the window again, and the frost had been disturbed. Faint smears were etched across it, wider this time, like it had been there for a moment, pressed flat. I could feel the cold radiating from the glass, and the unmistakable weight of something on the other side. The next day, my brother spoke for the first time about leaving. He was ready to sell his share, tired of the isolation, he said. I didn't press, though I suspected the decision was deeper than the monotony of snow or cold. Something about his face when he said it, the way he avoided my eyes, suggested there were memories he refused to acknowledge. I didn't argue. I kept my attention on the windows, on the frost, on the forest that had grown impossibly silent. After he left, I stayed alone for weeks. The sound continued, or at least I imagined it did. There were nights when I swore I could hear the scraping, dragging, circling, moving slowly but with precision just beyond the edge of sight. It never sped up, never stopped. The forest was still and lifeless under the snow, but the rhythm was undeniable. I would trace the windows with my hands, see the faint smudges left behind, wondering how the prints had formed, how something had moved with that weight and carefulness. I took to sleeping lightly, always awake for the sound, even if it was only in dreams. By mid-January, the dragging stopped for several nights. The silence was heavier than the noise had been, pressing against the cabin walls. I took the opportunity to explore farther into the forest, marking trails, checking for footprints, signs of elk, moose, or anything that could explain the nights. There was nothing. No animal signs beyond the occasional tracks far down the slope, no broken branches, no evidence of anything large that could account for the dragging. The snow was pristine, untouched except for the paths I made myself. Months later, the cabin felt like a different place. The forest had a cold beauty, but each night I would wake to the sensation of movement just beyond the edges of the clearing. My mind tricked me. I convinced myself it was wind, trees settling, animals. But deep down, I remembered those handprints. The ones too long, too many joints, pressed flat against the glass. Something had been close, had watched, had circled deliberately and left its mark. It wasn't elk. It wasn't moose. It wasn't anything natural that I could identify. My brother refuses to acknowledge any of it. He sold his share, moved back to the city, and the cabin became mine alone. I don't ask him about that winter. He doesn't bring it up. The forest can feel forgiving in daylight, but at night, under the weight of frost and darkness, that memory settles in the mind with the slow certainty of snow piling in drifts. I still dream of the sound, the rhythm of scraping, of something heavy being dragged over ice and snow, circling the cabin endlessly. In the dream, I watch it frozen, and it never stops, never changes pace, moving in careful circles, deliberate, patient, leaving traces that defy explanation. I wake to silence, but the memory remains. Even years later, when the cabin is locked up for the season and the snow presses in from every side, the recollection is sharp. There are nights when I lie awake, imagining the scraping just beyond the tree lean, listening to the way snow shifts under weight, wondering about those handprints, how the fingers bent and pressed. My brother will never talk about it. He refuses. He doesn't acknowledge it existed. But I remember everything. Every circle around the cabin. Every long-fingered handprint against frost. Every slow, patient scrape dragging across snow. The memory is so precise it has become a part of the rhythm of my own heartbeat, a constant measure of unease, impossible to forget. No one else was ever there. No one else could have been. The cabin was ours, alone in the Montana wilderness. And yet, for those nights, for that winter, something was there, moving with deliberation, watching, circling, dragging. It didn't hurry. It didn't pause. And it left its mark on the world in ways that cannot be explained, only remembered. Even now, years later, the sound returns in sleep, stretching over the snow, relentless, inevitable, and perfectly measured. It is a rhythm that belongs to the wilderness and to memory alike. The cabin is quiet in daylight. The snow sparkles. The forest exhales a soft, cold breath. But at night, in the corners of recollection, the scraping begins again, circling endlessly, leaving its weight in frost and snow, unbroken and unyielding. Booking the cabin had seemed simple. The photos online promised the perfect Colorado Rockies escape, snow glistening over steep peaks, the kind of isolation that felt like a luxury. 4 of us went, 2 friends from college, a cousin, and myself. The trip was supposed to be about snowboarding and hiking, a break from work and routines. The cabin had been inexpensive for the location, almost suspiciously so, but it looked charming enough in the pictures. Stone fireplace, log walls, open loft, wood floors polished smooth from years of use. The listing had been removed by the time we tried to show it to someone else. That felt odd, but we brushed it off as just the way the internet works. Arriving in the late afternoon, the mountains were glowing under the low sun, the sky a cold orange fading into purple. Snow blanketed the trees, muffling every sound. The road to the cabin was narrow, flanked by cliffs on one side and deep snowdrifts on the other. The moment the tires crunched through the driveway, it was clear there was no one else for miles. The cabin itself was tucked into a slight clearing, barely visible from the road, like it had grown out of the hillside. It had a simple charm, wooden siding dulled by weather but solid. The windows were large, letting in light and shadows alike, but no reflections caught the eye. At least, no mirrors anywhere were visible, not even in the bathroom. That seemed strange but convenient. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old pine and waxed wood. Dust lingered in corners, in a way that suggested it was mostly undisturbed. The loft ladder creaked under weight, connecting the main floor to a small upstairs sleeping area. Everything felt cozy, almost untouched. We spread our bags, checked the layout, and then moved toward unpacking. The kitchen had basic utensils and dishes, enough to cook meals but nothing lavish. It was practical, not designed for guests to linger indoors for long. Outside, the snow promised hours of boarding. Inside, it promised a quiet night's sleep. The first evening passed normally. After skiing and boarding all afternoon, we sat near the fireplace, eating cold sandwiches and laughing at our own mistakes on the slopes. One friend commented again about the absence of mirrors, how unusual it was for a rental. We joked about it, saying that maybe the previous owner hated checking appearances, or that mirrors were dangerous somehow. The conversation drifted, and eventually, we all went to bed in the loft. The beds were simple but comfortable, and with the cold outside, the warmth of thick blankets quickly became a relief. Late that night, one of us heard it first. Slow breathing, deliberate and measured, coming from the ladder that led to the loft. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss as the wind or the settling of the cabin. But it didn't stop. It had a rhythm, patient, almost deliberate. That sound lingered, making it impossible to settle fully. Every time eyes closed, the awareness of it grew heavier, a weight pressing into the room. It wasn't a rush or a yell, just breathing. Nothing else moved, no footsteps, no creaks from the floorboards below. Just the breathing. By morning, the sensation of being watched had settled into the edges of the day. We joked quietly about it over coffee, claiming sleep deprivation or imagination. The slopes took up the morning, sunlight hitting snow so hard it burned eyes. Afternoon brought shadows stretching across the cabin, the inside becoming darker earlier than expected. That night, the feeling returned. One friend claimed he saw someone standing behind me as I moved across the loft, only to realize, after a long blink, it was my own reflection, or at least something that looked exactly like me. The memory is vague, almost dreamlike, but the effect lingered, a sense that the space contained more than just the 4 of us. The cabin itself started to feel different with the shadows. Every corner, every stair, every loft beam began to seem like it held more than air. Floors creaked in ways that weren't consistent with movement. Objects left on tables seemed subtly displaced when no one had been near. None of it was violent or overt, just enough to unsettle the mind. It was the kind of subtle disorder that made small details unbearable, like the weight of noticing something impossible and not knowing how to respond. It was on the second day, mid-afternoon, that the discovery happened. In a corner of the main floor, there was a closet door that had been nailed shut. The wood was dark, faded by age, and the nails looked recent. We debated whether to force it open. Curiosity overcame hesitation, and we used a crowbar found in the small utility area near the garage to pry the door loose. Inside were mirrors, stacked face down, floor to ceiling in some places, leaning against each other in uneven piles. The frames were heavy, thick, some carved in ways that seemed overcomplicated for a simple cabin. Their surfaces faced downward, so nothing reflected back at us, but the sheer number of them was immediately oppressive. At some point, The absence of mirrors throughout the cabin clicked into focus. Whoever had lived here had clearly removed them, or at least kept them from being seen. That night, the breathing returned, slower now, heavier. It seemed closer, almost directly at the loft ladder. Not threatening, not urgent, but impossible to ignore. Sleep was fitful, each creak of the floor, each shadow cast by the firelight magnified into movement. The mirrors in the closet haunted the corners of our minds, a silent reminder that something had been intentionally hidden. The next morning, one of us found the guest book. It was in the drawer of the kitchen table, an old leather-bound book, pages yellowed at the edges. Entries from past visitors detailed normal vacations, observations of snow and trails, good food, bad weather, occasional wildlife. Most were pleasant, mundane, but the last page stopped mid-sentence. The pen had run out halfway through a paragraph, words abruptly ending as if the writer had left in a hurry. The sentences made no sense in context. There were phrases about moving mirrors, noticing shadows, hearing something in the loft. It was impossible to tell whether the author had been anxious, interrupted, or something else entirely. There was no signature, no date, just a fragment. Packing was hasty. There was a silent agreement among us, unspoken but unanimous, that checking out would not happen in the normal way. Luggage was shoved into the car, bindings snapped tight, doors closed without care. No one mentioned the mirrors in the closet again. The breathing from the ladder that last night, combined with the abrupt ending in the guest book, made lingering impossible. Even leaving in daylight, the cabin felt hostile, not overtly, but with the kind of intensity that made the air itself seem wrong. The drive back down the mountains was quiet. Sunlight reflected off snow, bright and cold, making eyes water. The roads were the same as before, narrow and winding, yet now every shadow of tree or rock held the memory of the loft, the closet, the mirrors. We didn't stop for coffee, food, or photos. The goal was to reach pavement and population. The silence in the car was not awkward. It was focused, each of us processing the unease in our own way. Even now, thinking back, the memory of that place is sharp. The absence of mirrors in normal spaces, the sudden stacked mirrors in the closet, the sound of slow, patient breathing. Each element made sense in isolation, but combined into an atmosphere that was impossible to ignore. Nothing supernatural occurred, nothing overtly violent. It was all perfectly explainable, and yet, the cabin retained a sense of intent, a meticulous arrangement designed to unsettle. The guest book, stored in a drawer somewhere in the cabin, might still contain that unfinished page. The mirrors likely remain face down in that closet, heavy and waiting, silent. The loft ladder creaks the same way, though no one climbs it, and the air, cold and dry, presses against the skin like quiet warning. That trip left no scars or injuries, no evidence, no story anyone could verify. It left only memory, persistent and specific, of a place designed to feel wrong without saying why. Returning to Colorado years later, the cabin had been removed from listings entirely. No website photos, no contact, nothing. It's as if it never existed, and yet it does. The memory of the stacked mirrors, the abrupt guest book, the patient breathing, all remain. The mountains themselves are unchanged, beautiful and deadly in their neutrality. But the cabin existed within them once, a place where time and attention were manipulated in subtle, precise ways. That week in March 2022 is remembered not for the snowboarding, not for the views, not for the cold air or the sunlight over the peaks. It is remembered for the cabin, for the deliberate absence of mirrors, the discovery behind the nailed door, the sensation that someone, or something, was watching from the loft without moving. All else is secondary. The trip ended abruptly, quietly, with 4 people agreeing to leave without formalities, the car sliding away down the mountain road, the echo of footsteps, the creak of a loft ladder, and the memory of mirrors stacked face down behind a door that had never been meant to be opened. The story is complete. Every detail, every movement, every shadow and creak remains fixed in memory. The cabin stands removed from the world, removed from listings, removed from verification. It exists only in recollection, a perfectly ordinary structure, yet entirely calculated to unsettle those inside. No screams, no apparitions, no violence, just mirrors, air, shadows, and patient breathing. The satisfaction lies in that clarity. The ending is exact, understood, and irreversible. The cabin was left, never returned to, and the memory remains, intact and unambiguous, waiting only in thought. November of 2020 pressed down on everything. That year carried weight in the air, the kind that made silence feel heavier than noise. Work had gone remote. Cities felt tense and crowded even when empty. The Adirondacks promised distance, isolation, and a sense of control that no longer existed anywhere else. A cabin showed up online that looked ordinary and cheap for the season. The price alone suggested something off, but travel options were limited and patience was thinner than usual. The place sat at the end of a plowed dirt road that narrowed into ruts before disappearing into trees. Cell service dropped 5 minutes before arrival. Snow had not fully settled yet, but the ground stayed hard and pale. Pines crowded close, tall and thin, blocking wind and light. The cabin appeared suddenly, low and dark, with a porch sagging slightly in the middle. No neighboring structures. No distant traffic noise. Just forest. The owner had been brief in her messages. She explained the low price by saying winter bookings were slow and she preferred short stays. One detail lingered from the exchange. Her father had built the cabin decades earlier and stayed there most of the year. He used to watch the land. That phrase stood out because it carried no clear meaning. She added that he had died there, natural causes, long ago. No elaboration followed. The message ended with check-in instructions and a reminder to lock up properly. The porch held 3 strings of bells nailed into the beams, each set at a different height. Small brass pieces, dull with age, tied with wire and fishing line. The owner's note said they were for bears. That made sense on the surface. Adirondack winters still had activity. Food left out could draw animals. Bells could serve as warning. The odd part came from placement. One set hung high enough to brush a shoulder. Another sat low, knee level. The third nearly scraped the porch boards, easily triggered by a foot. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and cleaning chemicals. A single propane heater stood in the main room. The floorboards creaked with uneven pressure. Furniture looked inherited rather than chosen. Everything felt preserved instead of maintained. Framed photos lined one wall. Most showed the same man at different ages, always outdoors, always near trees. He stood beside a fence, near a river, in snow up to his knees. No smiles, just a steady expression, eyes focused somewhere past the camera. The first night passed without incident. Cooking happened early. Darkness arrived fast. The forest swallowed light completely once the sun dropped behind the ridge. The bells stayed still. Sleep came light and shallow, broken by wind and branches shifting against each other. On the second night, the bells rang. Not all at once. A slow, uneven movement. Soft at first, then sharper, metal touching metal. That sound cut through sleep instantly. Awareness came before understanding. Stillness followed. No footsteps. No scratching. Just the fading echo of brass. Both people woke at different moments, confusion overlapping but unspoken. The porch stood empty when checked. Snow near the steps showed no disturbance. The bells hung motionless. It was easy to assume an animal brushed past and moved on. Bears did not linger in cold. The mind accepted that explanation because it wanted to. The next day stayed gray. Low clouds pressed down, dulling the forest into layers of muted green and white. The cabin felt smaller in daylight. The trees stood closer than remembered. Walking the perimeter showed no trails or clearings nearby. Everything blended together, trunks repeating in every direction. That night, sleep came uneven. Dreams felt close to waking, not vivid enough to recall, but heavy enough to leave residue. The bells rang again. Only one set this time. The lowest. A soft dragging sound followed, like wires shifting against wood. Awareness snapped back fast. One person woke fully. The other stayed asleep. Morning brought a strange detail. Bare footprints marked the frost near the porch. Not animal prints. Human. One set. The pattern showed hesitation rather than direction. Steps faced the tree-line and stopped several feet from the porch edge. The skin on the feet would have been exposed long enough to numb quickly. The temperature overnight had dropped well below freezing. No memory connected to that sight. No recollection of stepping outside. The explanation offered itself immediately. Sleepwalking. Stress did strange things. That year had delivered more than enough of it. A person could accept that answer and move on. The bells continued to ring each night. The pattern changed. Sometimes the highest string moved, brushing gently. Other nights the middle set chimed once or twice, spaced far apart. The timing stayed consistent. Only one person ever heard it. Never both. If one stayed awake long enough, The bells remained still. As soon as sleep claimed either body, sound followed. Waking outside happened again. Frost coated the ground thicker this time. Feet ached with a deep, dull pain that lingered long after warmth returned. The body stood facing the trees, shoulders squared, posture alert. No movement memory existed. The door stood open behind, heat spilling into cold air. The bells hung still. A search around the porch showed scuff marks where boots had been kicked aside. That detail explained part of it. Shoes removed intentionally, hands steady enough to untie laces. That did not align with a simple unconscious stumble. Sleepwalking could involve purpose, though. The brain followed routines. Years of stepping onto that porch while awake might translate into movement while asleep. Photos inside the cabin started to draw attention. The man in them appeared in similar stances, standing near tree leans, facing outward, often barefoot. That detail appeared only after noticing it once. Then it showed up repeatedly, bare feet on snow, on dirt, on frost. The expressions never changed. Sleep became fractured. Staying awake grew harder. The heater clicked and hissed. Wood popped. The forest remained silent beyond that. No animal sounds. No wind. Just quiet that pressed inward. Another morning brought more footprints. This time they extended farther from the porch, stopping just before the tree line. The spacing suggested slow movement. Deliberate steps. No stumbling. No dragging. The frost captured every detail. Toes spread. Weight shifted evenly. The bell's explanation unraveled slowly. A bear would have left tracks. Wind would have moved all the bells, not one set. The timing never varied. Only during sleep. Only one person at a time. An effort followed to stay awake together. Coffee brewed late. Lights stayed on. The body resisted. Exhaustion crept in anyway. One person drifted off without noticing. The bells rang immediately. Sharp and sudden. Awareness returned to find the other standing, fully awake, staring at the door. That moment ended quickly. The body sat down. Confusion registered. No memory connected the two states. Just a sense of having missed time. The final night came with resignation. Leaving early crossed the mind, but felt dramatic. The stay was nearly over anyway. Packing happened slowly. The forest looked unchanged. The cabin felt watchful, though no movement came from it. Sleep claimed one body deeply that night. The other stayed awake the entire time. Observation replaced fear. The door opened without hesitation. Bare feet stepped onto the porch. The bells did not ring at first. The body stood still for a long time, facing the trees. Hours passed. No shivering. No shifting weight. Whispering happened, barely audible. Repeated phrases without variation. The words made sense. The tone sounded rehearsed. "I'll take the shift." The bells rang only once near dawn, when the body stepped back inside. Shoes remained untouched. Feet showed no injury beyond redness. Sleep resumed instantly. Morning came gray again. Packing finished quickly. The drive out passed without comment. Neither person addressed what happened. The cabin disappeared behind trees. Cell service returned miles later. The explanation unfolded over time, separate from that place. Research followed quietly. Old habits surfaced. The owner's father had lived alone for decades. Locals remembered him as vigilant. He believed land required presence to stay safe. He stayed awake through nights, walking boundaries, watching tree leans. He trusted shifts and routines more than locks. That mindset could transfer. Stress, isolation, unfamiliar environment, and suggestion combined into behavior. The bells provided cue and confirmation. The photos reinforced patterns. The brain filled gaps with structure. Sleepwalking took on purpose because purpose had been planted. 6 months passed before separation happened. The cabin never came up again. The relationship fractured under unrelated strain. Sleep returned to normal after leaving the mountains. No more waking outside. No bells. No shifts. The memory stayed intact, though. Clear. Grounded. Explained. The forest did nothing. The cabin held no presence. The danger came from a mind under pressure, searching for order, borrowing it from a man who once stood barefoot in the cold, watching land that never asked to be watched. My name is Eric. The cabin came up on a short-term rental site with a low price and no recent reviews. The listing showed a narrow building set back from a logging road, surrounded by fir and alder. The description used words like quiet, private, and rustic. The photos showed mismatched furniture, a wood stove, and a kitchen that looked untouched since the late 70s. That suited the plan. A week alone was supposed to reset things. Work had bled into sleep, sleep into work. Silence felt necessary. The drive took longer than expected. Pavement turned to gravel, then to rutted dirt. Cell service dropped miles before arrival. The cabin appeared suddenly, pressed against the tree line, roof sagging at the edges. A creek ran behind it, shallow and loud enough to cover other sounds. The air smelled of wet wood and old leaves. The door opened with a stiff scrape. Inside felt colder than outside, even with afternoon light pushing through the windows. The place carried age in every surface. Floors bowed under weight. The ceiling dipped near the stove. The furniture came from different decades, all worn. Dust coated the tops of cabinets, but not the table or counters. Someone had cleaned recently, but not carefully. A faint smell of bleach hung under the scent of mildew. The refrigerator hummed louder than expected. The walls were thin planks, painted white long ago and yellowed by smoke. Supplies came in one trip from the car. Groceries, water, a sleeping bag, a notebook. No television, no radio. Power ran from a line strung between trees, thin and low. The breaker box sat in a closet near the back door, labeled by hand in faded ink. Late afternoon passed with small tasks. Food went into cabinets. Windows were checked and locked. The stove flue was opened. A fire caught on the second match. Heat crept slowly. Outside, the light faded early, filtered by branches. The forest pressed close, dense and quiet. While moving the kitchen table to set a rug under it, something caught attention behind one leg. Pencil marks sat on the wall, low and hidden by the table. Thin lines, faint but deliberate. At first glance they looked like tallies. Vertical strokes grouped in clusters, some slashed through. The graphite had sunk into the wood grain. The marks ran in a column about 2 feet long. The table blocked most of them. Once it was moved fully aside, more appeared. The pattern shifted on closer inspection. Each group had small numbers scratched beside them. Dates, month and day, sometimes a year. Some were crossed out with a hard line. Others were circled. The writing changed slightly over time, sometimes darker, sometimes lighter, as if different pencils were used. The earliest date sat near the floor, almost hidden by the baseboard. The latest rested near the middle of the wall. The most recent date matched the day before arrival. The marks did not fit the rental description. No mention of a guest book on the wall. No playful carving. The placement was too hidden. The pressure of the pencil varied, but the intent stayed the same. Someone had stood in that exact spot many times and marked time passing. The wall was wiped with a damp cloth. The marks stayed. They were not surface dirt. The wood itself had been scored. A knot in the plank ran through one date, warping the numbers. A crack followed the grain between 2 others. The wall had been repaired around them, paint layered over older paint, but the marks remained visible, either forgotten or ignored. Night settled fully. The fire burned steady. Food was simple and eaten standing at the counter. The sense of being watched did not arrive with drama. It came as a mild unease, the awareness of space beyond the windows, thick with trees and dark. That feeling usually faded with time in isolated places. This time it stayed. Sleep came late. The bed sat against the far wall, opposite the kitchen. The mattress sagged in the middle. The ceiling above showed a long stain from an old leak. The fire died down but left enough heat. Wind moved through branches. The creek kept its rhythm. Sometime after midnight, a sound cut through the background. Footsteps. Slow, even close. Not on the porch. Not inside. The pacing followed the wall, stopping near corners, then resuming. Each step pressed into dirt or gravel. The pattern repeated. The steps were measured, as if someone counted them. No rush. No stumble. The body stayed still. Breath slowed. The sound circled the cabin once, then again. It paused near the kitchen wall, right where the marks were hidden. Weight shifted. Leaves crunched. A hand brushed against the siding, light enough to barely register. The steps moved on. Time stretched. The pacing continued, then stopped. Silence returned. Sleep did not. At 3:02 a.m., scratching started. The sound came from inside the walls. Not rodents. Too controlled. Fingertips dragged along the interior planks, testing seams, pressing lightly, then harder. The pattern moved horizontally, then vertically, as if mapping the structure. The sound traveled, stopping, resuming, always close. The walls were thin. Every motion carried. The scratching never broke through. It never rushed. It lasted several minutes, then stopped cleanly. No footsteps followed. The creak filled the space again. Morning arrived gray and cold. Fog sat low between trees. The fire was out. Breath showed in the air. The marks on the wall were checked again. The dates felt heavier in daylight. The most recent one had been circled. The pencil line was darker than others, fresher. Packing happened fast. Food went back into bags. The sleeping bag was rolled tight. Windows were checked again. Nothing outside showed disturbance. No footprints stood out in the damp ground, only old impressions softened by moisture. The drive out felt longer. The road seemed narrower. The forest closed in tighter. Relief came only when cell service returned. Back home, the search began. County records were incomplete online, but enough surfaced to raise concern. The land had changed hands several times between the 1920s and 1940s. One owner held it briefly during the early 30s. No building permits from that period were listed, but aerial photos from later decades showed a structure in the same location. Local archives held more. A scanned newspaper from 1934 mentioned an unofficial holding site used by a private group during labor disputes. Detainees were kept temporarily, away from towns, questioned, then released or transferred. The site was described as a small cabin near a creek, accessible by logging road. The article avoided specifics. Names were not printed. Another document referenced complaints filed years later, claims of unlawful detention and abuse. The case never went to trial. Records ended abruptly. The land returned to private use. The cabin remained. The dates on the wall aligned with known periods of activity. Clusters matched weeks when strikes peaked. Crossed-out dates matched documented transfers. Circled dates corresponded with deaths listed in coroner summaries. Bodies found days later near rivers or roads, causes ruled accidental. The most recent date had no public record. That date fell during a period when the property was supposedly vacant. Yet maintenance logs from a utility company showed power usage spikes over several nights leading up to that day. Further digging revealed a caretaker hired by the current owner, tasked with checking the property between rentals. The caretaker lived nearby, off-grid, known for keeping to himself. He had access to the cabin, keys, and knowledge of its history. Notes in a private forum mentioned his obsession with preserving the site, with keeping its story alive. The forum post stopped months earlier. A missing persons report filed 2 days after arrival date appeared in a neighboring county. The last known location was a trailhead near the logging road. No body had been found. The pacing, the scratching, the dates all pointed to a person using the cabin as more than a rental. Someone tracking arrivals, marking time, revisiting old patterns. Someone using the walls to listen, to test, to feel control over a space that once held others against their will. The explanation did not bring comfort. It brought clarity. The cabin was cheap because it carried a history few wanted. Isolation made oversight easy. The caretaker's access allowed movement unnoticed. The dates were not memories. They were records. The listing went offline weeks later. The property changed hands again within the year. No charges were filed. The missing person remained missing. The cabin still stands, according to satellite images, roof sagging a little more, trees creeping closer. The marks on the wall likely remain, layered under new paint, faint but present. Dates waiting for someone to notice. Near Lake Crescent, Washington, July 2017. My name is Leah. The trip was supposed to be quiet. 2 weeks off from work, no signal, no plans. A cheap cabin north of the lake showed up through a rental site that no longer exists. The photos were plain. Cedar siding, metal roof, gravel drive, tall trees pressing in from every side. The description promised clean water, a wood stove, and privacy. That was enough. The drive from Port Angeles took longer than expected. Cell service dropped early. The road narrowed and lost its lines. Rain came and went in short bursts, the kind that never fully stops in the Olympic Peninsula. By the time the turnoff appeared, daylight had started to flatten. The cabin sat back from the road behind alder and fir, with a short dirt path that ended at a small clearing. No other structures nearby. No neighboring lights. Just trees and the sound of water moving somewhere beyond them. Inside smelled like old wood and lemon cleaner. The place had one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a bathroom tucked into the back corner. Everything looked used but cared for. Scratches in the table, a chipped mug, towels folded in uneven stacks. A printed sheet of rules sat on the counter, laminated and smudged at the edges. Nothing about the cabin felt staged. It felt lived in by people who didn't think much about presentation. The bathroom was larger than expected. A deep sink set into a pine vanity. Above it, a mirror that stretched nearly the width of the wall. The glass looked slightly gray, not the bright silver common in hotels. The light fixture sat above the mirror, a long bar with 4 bulbs that cast a flat, even glow. No windows. The door closed with a soft click. The first night passed without incident. Unpacking took little time. Dinner came from a cooler. Sleep came easily. The forest carried sound well, but nothing felt out of place. Wind through branches. A distant splash that could have been a fish or falling debris. The kind of noise that fades once the body relaxes. Morning brought fog and wet ground. The lake stayed hidden, but the air felt cool and clean. Coffee tasted better than usual. The cabin held its temperature well. The bathroom mirror reflected everything as expected. Face tired from travel. Hair bent from sleep. No distortion beyond the slight waviness that old glass sometimes has at the edges. The second day passed quietly. A short hike. A drive along the lake. Photos taken and quickly forgotten. By evening, rain returned and stayed. The sound on the metal roof became steady and low. The cabin felt smaller with the windows darkened. At 11:38 p.m., teeth brushing before bed, something felt off. The motion of an arm lifting the toothbrush didn't line up. The reflection followed, but not exactly. The delay lasted less than a second. A blink of time. The kind of thing that could be explained by fatigue or distraction. The brain expects immediate feedback. Any deviation stands out. A small laugh escaped at the thought of letting nerves get involved. The trip had been quiet. Too quiet. The body looks for stimulation and finds it where it can. Brushing continued. The delay didn't repeat. The face in the glass moved normally again. Sleep came later that night. The rain didn't stop. Dreams stayed shallow and broken. Morning light came gray and flat. The third day stayed overcast. No plans. Time moved slowly. Reading, cooking, pacing. The cabin creaked with temperature shifts. The smell of damp would never left. Late in the afternoon, the bathroom mirror caught attention again. The reflection looked normal. Lighting unchanged. Nothing wrong with the glass itself. Running a finger along the surface found no seams. No gaps. The mirror felt solid, heavy old. Night arrived without ceremony. Dinner finished early. The rest of the evening passed with a book and a headlamp when the overhead lights felt too harsh. At 11:38 p.m., brushing teeth again, the mirror showed something that couldn't be ignored. The reflection smiled. Not wide, not exaggerated. A small, relaxed change in the mouth that came before any movement on this side of the glass. The muscles in the face here stayed neutral. The smile existed only in the reflection. It lasted a moment, long enough to register, long enough to confirm it wasn't a trick of light. The body reacted before thought formed. Turning toward the room behind brought nothing. The bathroom door stood open. The hallway beyond stayed dark. No sound, no movement. The cabin felt unchanged. Looking back at the mirror showed a neutral expression, exactly matching. No smile, no lag, no distortion. Sleep didn't happen that night. The car keys sat on the table. A blanket and pillow went into the back seat. The drive out felt reckless in the dark, but staying felt worse. Gravel crunched too loudly. The trees pressed close. The car faced the road and stayed there until morning. Sunrise brought clarity, but not relief. Returning to the cabin felt necessary. Belongings needed packing. The bathroom door stayed open. The mirror stayed avoided. Nothing else unusual happened. No further delays. No expressions out of sync. The listing vanished 2 weeks later. At the time, the explanation settled on stress and coincidence. The mind can create patterns where none exist. Fatigue and isolation alter perception. Mirrors play tricks. Memory shifts over time. The story could have ended there. It didn't. Months later, curiosity resurfaced. The cabin address had been saved. A search through county records showed the property changed hands in late 2017. The previous owner's name appeared in a local news archive. Not a major story. A short article about an arrest related to illegal surveillance equipment, found in a rural rental property. No mention of a lake. No mention of a cabin. Just enough detail to connect the dots. Further digging uncovered a patent filing tied to the same name. Smart mirror technology. Early prototypes. Two-way glass bonded to LCD panels. Motion tracking. Facial recognition. The goal stated as enhanced user experience. Personalized lighting. Wellness feedback. The dates matched the period before the trip. Understanding came slowly and reluctantly. The mirror in the cabin wasn't a mirror in the traditional sense. It was a display behind glass. A camera captured the image. Software processed it. The image then appeared on the screen. A delay of half a second fit. Buffering. Processing lag. Poor connectivity in a remote area. The smile made sense in a way that still feels uncomfortable. Facial recognition software predicts expressions. It smooths transitions. It fills gaps when data drops. If the system lost tracking for a moment, it could interpolate the next likely state. A neutral face brushing teeth at night often ends with a smile. The algorithm guessed. The guess appeared before the actual movement. The reason it reset after turning away became clear too. The system likely recalibrated when the face left the frame. When the face returned, the feed aligned again. The bathroom had no windows. Lighting stayed constant. The environment was ideal for controlled capture. The mirror's size hid the technology well. The gray tint masked the display. The slight waviness at the edges came from layered materials. Sleeping in the car that night avoided further exposure. Packing quickly prevented additional data capture. The disappearance of the listing followed the investigation. The property sale closed the chapter. Nothing supernatural happened near Lake Crescent. No entities watched from the trees. No forces followed back home. What happened stayed rooted in technology, privacy violations, and the discomfort of being observed without consent. The memory still carries weight. Not because something unknown occurred, but because something known did. A person installed equipment to watch strangers in a place meant for rest. The delay and the smile broke the illusion of safety. The mirror revealed itself as a screen. The reflection stopped being passive. That understanding brought closure. The event fit into the real world. It followed rules. It had causes and consequences. The fear came from recognizing how easily perception can be manipulated and how thin the line is between normal and wrong when trust is assumed. The lake remains beautiful. The forest remains quiet. The cabin exists under new ownership, stripped of hidden devices. The experience ended the moment the explanation became complete. The mirror never smiled on its own again. Late October 2016 carried a thin, biting cold into the northern Idaho panhandle. The drive north felt longer than the map suggested, a slow climb through pine and fir that swallowed cell service mile by mile. Gravel replaced pavement. Ruts held rainwater that reflected a dull gray sky. The truck heater rattled and smelled faintly of old dust and antifreeze. That sound became a companion, something to focus on instead of the tremor that crept into hands when the road narrowed and the last mailbox disappeared. The cabin sat at the end of a spur road that looked abandoned, even by logging standards. Alder branches scraped the sides of the truck. A fallen gate lay half buried in leaves, pushed aside long ago. The clearing opened suddenly, a rough oval of dirt and needles surrounded by trees so tall the tops vanished into low cloud. No neighboring lights. No power lines. Just a squat structure with a sagging tin roof and a porch that leaned away from the door by a few degrees, like it had given up on standing straight. That place came with a reason. A doctor had leaned back on a rolling stool, hands folded, eyes tired rather than stern. The warning had been simple and final. Stop drinking or die early. No pamphlets. No referrals. Just distance from everything that made the habit easy. A former coworker had mentioned an uncle who owned an off-grid hunting cabin. Cash under the table. No questions. A key taped under a loose board on the porch. The plan was isolation, boredom, cold nights, and time. The door stuck before opening. Hinges protested. Inside smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and mouse droppings. One room, maybe 12 by 16. A small table. Two chairs that did not match. A cot pushed against the far wall. A wood stove squatted near the center with a length of black pipe disappearing through the ceiling. A counter with a single-burner propane stove. Shelves held jars of nails, a dented kettle, a flashlight that rattled when shaken. Light came from a window the size of a suitcase, cloudy with age, and from the door when it stood open. Boots sat by that door. Heavy logging boots. Dark brown leather split at the seams, toes worn down to pale ovals. Dried mud caked the soles in thick layers that held the imprint of rocks and needles. The size looked wrong. Bigger than anything owned. The assumption formed without thought. Those belonged to the owner or some relative who had been there last. The place came furnished. That was part of the deal. No reason to move them. Supplies went onto the counter. Water came from the hand pump outside, cold enough to numb fingers within seconds. The stove took longer to light than expected. Smoke backdraft into the room before drawing up the pipe. The first fire crackled unevenly. Sparks jumped when damp would caught. The cabin warmed slowly, uneven patches of heat that never reached the corners. Night arrived early. Trees pressed close to the windows, trunks dark and wet. Wind slid through branches with a low hiss. Sleep came in shallow bursts. Dreams tangled with the smell of smoke and the awareness of distance from any help. Morning brought pale light and silence. No birdsong, just the drip of condensation from the roof. Coffee tasted thin. Hands shook less after the first cup. The boots remained by the door, untouched. Routine formed quickly. Wake before dawn. Feed the stove. Pump water. Eat from cans. Walk the clearing to stretch legs. The forest edge loomed close, thick with brush and fallen limbs. Tracks crossed the mud near the pump. Deer. Something smaller. No clear boot prints beyond the truck's arrival. The second night passed without incident. Sleep still fractured, but exhaustion helped. The third night ended differently. Movement registered before sound. A subtle change in the dark. The boots stood closer to the cot. Not right next to it. Just a little nearer than before, angled inward. The detail lodged in the mind and refused to leave. Memory replayed the moment of stepping over them the night before. That step had been wider. The space had been larger. No effort went into moving them back. Touching someone else's boots felt wrong. The explanation stayed practical. Maybe the floor sloped. Maybe a mouse knocked into them. Maybe the mind played tricks under stress and withdrawal. At 2:17 a.m., a sound cut through sleep. Boots on dirt. Slow. Measured. Not circling. Back and forth. A short distance, maybe 10 steps each way. The rhythm stayed steady. No scraping. No stumble. The pacing lasted long enough to count breaths, then stopped. Silence returned so completely the ears rang. Morning light revealed no tracks near the door. Dew had fallen. Mud held the same impressions as before. The boots inside remained where they had been, closer than before. Daylight hours dragged. Time stretched without distraction. Reading lost focus. Thoughts looped. Thirst for alcohol crept in with physical weight, a pressure behind the eyes. Hands clenched and unclenched. Work filled the hours. Chopping wood. Clearing brush. Anything to burn off the nervous energy. Night 3 brought the same pacing at the same minute. A glance at the watch confirmed it. 2:17, back and forth. A waiting motion. The boots inside did not move that night. Night 4 followed the same pattern. Pacing outside. No approach. No retreat. Just presence. The body learned the sound. Sleep came only after it ended. Morning 5 revealed absence. The boots by the door were gone. The space looked wrong without them, too empty. A search of the cabin found nothing. The porch held no sign. Panic rose fast and sharp. Own boots were missing too. The shed stood 20 yards from the cabin, a crooked structure with a padlock that hung open. Behind it, arranged with care, sat the missing footwear. Personal boots stacked neatly. Toes pointed toward the trees. The logging boots sat beside them, aligned the same way. Mud around them remained undisturbed, as if they had been placed gently, not carried through the muck. The meaning landed with clarity. Someone had been there. Someone strong enough to carry boots without leaving a trace. Someone who knew the schedule, the sleep patterns, the exact moment when movement outside would be noticed, but not challenged. Departure followed fast. Gear thrown into the truck. Stove left cold. No effort made to hide fear. The drive out felt longer, every shadow loaded with intent. The forest watched in silence. Weeks later, back among people and noise, the craving for alcohol faded. The memory of boots remained sharp. Fear replaced habit. That fear held. Years passed without a drink. Strength and fear looked similar from a distance. In that cabin, fear won. That victory saved a life. My name is Aaron. Summer of 2012 sits in memory with the flat clarity of a sunburn that never quite fades. That season was spent alone in the eastern Oregon high desert, miles from towns, following faint traces of 19th century homesteads for a field guide that no publisher had yet agreed to print. The work required days of walking through cheatgrass and basalt, reading land the way surveyors once did, searching for cellars collapsed into themselves and fence posts silvered by 100 winters. The heat carried a dry metallic taste. Every sound traveled far. Solitude felt normal there. Maps showed nothing where the creek bed cut south through a shallow draw. Satellite images hinted at a line of cottonwoods, so a detour made sense. The creek had been dry for years, a pale ribbon of silt winding between banks chewed by erosion. Boot soles sank into powder. Hoof prints marked mule deer traffic. Halfway down the draw, a squared shadow interrupted the horizon line. Weathered boards rose behind a tangle of rabbit brush. A cabin. No record placed a structure there. No trail led toward it. The roofline sat too low for a barn, too neat for a line shack. Cedar shingles lay intact, darkened by age but not rotten. The door hung straight. Window glass reflected sky. Signs pointed toward neglect without collapse, as if time had been paused rather than allowed to proceed. Approach raised questions. No fresh tire marks. No recent ash. No smoke smell. Yet the air close to the walls felt warmer, carrying the faint scent of old iron. The stovepipe held a dusting of soot that had not fully settled. A hand on the iron door of the cook stove confirmed it. Heat remained. Not scalding, but alive. Food wrappers or sleeping gear would have signaled a squatter. None appeared. The interior showed order. A narrow bed stood against the north wall. A table held a lantern with a wick trimmed clean. Shelves held jars of nails sorted by size, a box of matches sealed in wax, and notebooks stacked with care. Paper yellowed at the edges. Pens sat nearby, capped. No footprints disturbed the floor dust. The stove, cast iron and cracked along one leg, held a banked bed of coals under ash, preserved in a way learned through practice. Those notebooks drew attention. Each cover differed. Some bore dates decades apart. One held a pressed sage sprig. Another had water damage on the corner. The first page of each contained the same opening line, written by different hands, similar in message though not identical in form. The statement described an intention limited to a single night. The rest of the pages described careful inventories of supplies, weather notes, repairs made to the structure, and observations about the land. Names changed. Ages varied. The handwriting styles differed enough to rule out a single author. Reading continued for hours. Heat built in the cabin as the sun rose. The warmth of the stove made sense only if someone had been present recently. The notebooks suggested patterns of temporary stays that stretched back decades. Some entries ended abruptly. Others concluded with lists and maps that led nowhere. Sleep came late that night on the narrow bed. The lantern had been extinguished. The door remained latched. Wind moved through the draw, brushing the walls with dry grass. At intervals, a muted thump sounded from within the structure itself. The noise came from inside the walls, not outside. It carried the rhythm of knuckles meeting wood through fabric. Not frantic, not random. Slow, patient impacts that traveled along the studs, sometimes near the head of the bed, sometimes at floor level, sometimes behind the stove. Pauses stretched long enough to convince the mind that it had been imagined, then resumed with the same pressure. Sleep fractured. The desert cooled. The smell of warm metal and dust thickened the air. Each impact arrived with a dull resonance, the sound absorbed by old lumber. No scratching followed. No voices. The impacts followed no pattern tied to wind gusts. The sensation of being studied arose, not through sound but through timing. The knocking never came from the same place twice in a row. Morning light exposed nothing unusual. Walls stood solid. No holes. No signs of animals. The exterior showed no disturbance. The creek bed lay empty. Wind had died. Returning inside, the notebooks were checked again. One now contained pages filled with handwriting matching the style used in field notes carried in a pack. The ink had bled slightly, suggesting it had been laid down hours earlier. The content described actions that had not yet occurred. A note about checking the stovepipe cap. A description of burning sagebrush to test wind direction. A statement about leaving before noon. Confusion sharpened into dread. Carbon monoxide poisoning crossed the mind, but the stove had been vented and the door opened during the night. Dehydration could explain confusion, but not ink on paper. Sleepwalking seemed possible, though unfamiliar. The realization that the cabin might be influencing behavior through routine and expectation carried more weight than any single explanation. The decision to destroy the structure formed quickly. Fire had removed countless abandoned buildings across the west, often through carelessness. Clearing brush around the cabin took hours. A ring of bare earth encircled the walls. Wind remained calm. Flames caught the dry boards and climbed with speed. Heat pushed outward. Smoke rose straight up. The fire consumed the interior, the notebooks curling into ash, the bed collapsing inward. The stove glowed, then dulled. The fire did not spread. Grass beyond the cleared ring remained untouched. When the roof fell, the flames settled and died within the footprint of the cabin. Only embers remained by afternoon. The land showed no scar beyond blackened soil where the structure had stood. Leaving the draw, footsteps felt watched but not followed. The high desert resumed its indifferent silence. Weeks later, notes written during that trip were reviewed. No mention appeared of actions that had not occurred. The memory of the cabin remained sharp, framed by heat and the sound of fists against hidden wood. The field guide was never completed. That area of the map remains blank by choice. The cabin no longer exists, and returning would serve no purpose. The desert keeps what it wants,